The notice was not delivered with anger, nor with any discernible emotion at all. It was a simple, administrative fact, presented over a lukewarm cup of coffee at the kitchen table where she had eaten every meal for 24 years. The house was sold. Thomas, her stepfather, a man who organized his life and his grief with the dispassionate precision of an actuary, folded the crisp legal document and slid it back into its envelope. He did not meet her eyes. He was looking at the wall calendar, as if her entire life was merely an appointment to be concluded. Elara said nothing. She did not cry. She did not plead. The capacity for such displays had been burned out of her years ago, cauterized by the slow, grinding loss of her father, first to his sickness and then to the earth. In the 5 years since, she had existed in this house as a ghost, a silent caretaker of her father's memory in a place that no longer felt his presence. Thomas, who had married her mother after her father's passing and then inherited the home after her mother's own swift decline, had never been cruel. He was worse. He was indifferent. "You have until the end of the month," he stated, his voice as flat as the tabletop between them. "The new owners wish to take possession on the 1st. He finally looked at her then, a brief, uncomfortable flicker of something that might have been pity, but was more likely just annoyance at the untidiness of the situation. "I've arranged a final settlement. For your trouble." He pushed a small, thin envelope across the table. It was not the legal document. It was a standard bank envelope. Her fingers, calloused from work he never saw or acknowledged, closed around it. It felt impossibly light. Inside, she knew, would be a paltry sum, an amount calculated to dismiss, not to support. It was an insult wrapped in the guise of closure. She did not open it. To do so would be to participate in the transaction, to accept its terms. Instead, she slid it into the pocket of her worn denim jacket. Her father had been a stonemason and a carpenter, a man who spoke in the language of grain and stress, of level lines and true angles. He believed that the world could be understood and, to some extent, mended, with the right tools and a patient hand. He had not taught her these things as lessons, but as a way of life. From the time she could walk, she had been at his side, the scent of sawdust and pine resin her first and most constant memory. He taught her how to read the story of a tree and its rings, how to split granite with a feather and wedge, how to join two pieces of wood so seamlessly they appeared to have grown that way. "Competence," he used to say, his voice a low rumble against the rasp of a handplane, "is a shelter no one can take from you." When he knew his time was short, he had given her his most prized possession. It was not a deed or a bond, but a tool, a plumb bob, cast from solid brass, heavy and cool in her palm. It was old, of his own father's time, but perfectly machined, its point still needle-sharp. It hung from a braided leather cord, stained dark with the sweat and oil of 2 generations of honest work. It was a tool for finding the vertical truth, for establishing a line straight to the center of the earth. For her, it was the physical embodiment of his soul, unwavering, balanced, and true. She stood up from the table, the chair making no sound on the worn linoleum. Thomas was already sorting through other papers, her expulsion now a completed task on his daily list. She walked through the house that was no longer hers, her footsteps echoing with the ghosts of her father's laughter and the scent of her mother's baking. In her room, she did not pack memories. She packed for survival. Into a heavy canvas satchel went a change of clothes, a whetstone, a small hand-forged hatchet, a coil of rope, and her father's small, leather-bound tool roll. She unstitched a hidden pocket in the satchel's lining and tucked the plumb bob inside, its weight a familiar, grounding presence against her back. She left the house through the back door, the same one she had used 1,000 times running out to her father's workshop. She did not look back. The past was a closed book, and Thomas was its cold, final punctuation. With the thin envelope from the bank still untouched in her pocket, she walked down the gravel drive and onto the paved road, turning her face toward the distant, hazy blue line of the mountains her father had always called the spine of the world. The journey was a blur of asphalt, then gravel, then dirt. She walked for 3 days, sleeping in copses of trees and buying bread and cheese with the few loose dollars she had in another pocket. The world of manicured lawns and identical houses fell away, replaced by rolling foothills, and then the steep, pine-choked inclines of the high country. The air grew thin and sharp, smelling of damp earth and cold stone. It was a harsh landscape, but an honest one. It made no promises it could not keep. On the 4th day, she arrived in a small, forgotten town, nestled in a narrow valley, a single dusty street, flanked by false-fronted buildings. It was called Terminus. The name felt appropriate. In the county clerk's office, a cramped room smelling of dry paper and stale coffee, she finally opened the envelope from Thomas. Inside were 2 $100 bills, $200, a final dismissive valuation of 24 years of her life. The bitterness rose in her throat, hot and metallic, but she swallowed it down. It was fuel now. As she stood there, folding the bills into a tight square, 2 old men in overalls were leaning against the counter, speaking to the clerk. Their voices were a low, conspiratorial murmur. "Still got the old Kane place on the books for back taxes, Al?" one of them asked, spitting a stream of tobacco juice into a brass spittoon. The clerk, a man with a perpetually bored expression and ink-stained fingers, sighed. "For another week. Then the county takes it proper. Not that it matters. Nobody's fool enough to buy that pile of rocks." "Silas Kane's folly," the other man chuckled. "Heard that place is cursed. Built it right on the ridge after his partner cheated him. Died up there all alone. They say his ghost still keeps the fire lit." Alara's attention sharpened. She stepped closer, her satchel creaking softly. "What place is this?" she asked, her voice quiet. The clerk, Al, looked her up and down, his gaze lingering on her dusty clothes and the exhaustion etched on her face. A flicker of amusement crossed his features. "The old Kane cabin, up on Whisperwind Ridge. Nothing but a ruin. Roof's gone, walls are crumbling. Been abandoned for 50 years. How much for the back taxes?" Alara's voice was steady, betraying none of the desperate, sudden hope that flared in her chest. The clerk's smirk widened. He enjoyed this part. $150, he said, leaning back in his chair as if announcing the punchline to a long joke. "Gets you the deed to 3 acres of useless rock and a pile of rotten timber." The 2 old men snickered. Alara ignored them. She unfolded one of the $100 bills and added a 50 she'd had tucked away. She pushed the money across the worn wooden counter. "I'll take it." The clerk's smirk vanished, replaced by disbelief, then by a kind of predatory glee. He had found his fool. He quickly stamped a series of documents, his movements suddenly efficient. He took her money, counted it twice as if it might disappear, and slid a yellowed, brittle deed across to her. "Sold," he said, the word ringing with finality and ridicule. "Pleasure doing business with you." Alara took the deed, the paper fragile as a dead leaf in her hands. She folded it carefully and placed it in her jacket pocket, separate from the remaining $50. She turned and walked out of the office, the sound of the men's suppressed laughter following her into the thin mountain air. She did not care. For the first time in 5 years, she owned something. It might be a ruin. It might be a folly. But it was hers. The climb to Whisperwind Ridge took the rest of the day. There was no road, only a barely there game trail that switchbacked steeply up the mountainside. The air grew colder, the pines thicker. By late afternoon, she broke through the tree line onto a high, windswept saddle of rock. And there it was. The clerk had not been lying. He had, if anything, understated the decay. The cabin was a skeleton. It had been built in 2 parts, a larger timber-framed addition, whose roof had completely collapsed inward, leaving a jagged maw of splintered rafters open to the sky, and an older, smaller section made of massive, expertly laid stones. This original structure, anchored by a towering stone chimney, was still standing, though its roof was a patchwork of holes and its single window was a dark, empty eye. Nature was not so much reclaiming it as it was swallowing it whole. A wave of despair, cold and vast as the mountain view, washed over her. The clerk's laughter echoed in her mind. A fool. She had spent almost everything she had on a ghost story and a pile of rocks. She sank onto a nearby boulder, the weight of her satchel and her journey pressing down on her. The sun was dipping below the far peaks, painting the sky in brutal shades of orange and purple. The wind whispered through the ruins, a lonely, mournful sound. She sat there until the cold began to seep into her bones. Then the words of her father surfaced from the depths of her memory. "Find the strongest point. Start there." She pushed herself to her feet. The despair had not vanished, but it had receded, beaten back by the ingrained habit of assessment. She walked toward the ruin, her eyes scanning not for what was lost, but for what remained. The timber section was a loss, at least for now. But the stone portion, the original heart of the cabin, was magnificent. Even in its decay, the quality of the masonry was breathtaking. The stones were huge, irregular pieces of granite, fitted together with such precision that in many places there was no need for mortar. This was the work of a master, a man who understood stone as a living thing. A kinship, distant but powerful, stirred in her. Silas Cain had not been a madman. He had been an artist. She pushed open the remains of a heavy plank door into the stone room. It was small, no more than 12 feet square. The air inside was thick with the smell of damp earth, rot, and the ghosts of 1,000 wood fires. The floor was packed earth, and one corner was piled high with debris from the partially collapsed roof. But the far wall was dominated by a colossal stone hearth, black with the soot of ages, its mantle a single, massive slab of granite. This was the anchor, the strongest point. This would be her shelter. She spent what was left of the daylight clearing a small space on the floor, pulling out rotten timbers and loose stones. As she worked, a kind of grim determination settled over her. This was no different from any other job. It was just bigger. The problem was broken down into smaller pieces: shelter, water, fire, food. She could do this. She had the skills. The next morning, she began the methodical work of clearing the stone room. She used her hatchet to cut away the rotten roofing, letting the clean mountain sunlight stream in. With her hands and a broken piece of planking for a shovel, she cleared the debris from the floor. It was backbreaking labor, but it was honest. With every stone she moved, every armful of rotten wood she tossed outside, the space felt a little more hers. By the third day, she had cleared the entire room down to the packed earth and the stone walls. She was sweeping the last of the dust and rubble from around the base of the great hearth when she noticed it. An anomaly. One of the hearthstones, a flat, squarish piece of granite set flush with the floor, was different from the others. It was a slightly lighter shade, a pale gray against the mottled charcoal of its neighbors. And while the surrounding stones were filmed with a thick layer of ancient soot, this one was cleaner, as if it had been disturbed more recently than 50 years ago. Curiosity, sharp and insistent, cut through her fatigue. She knelt, her fingers tracing the seam around the stone. It was a perfect fit, but the line was too clean. She tapped it with the handle of her hatchet. The sound was a dull thud. She tapped the stone next to it. A solid, dense thump. She went back to the first stone. She tapped it again, near the center. Thud. Then, near the edge closest to the firebox, she tapped again. And there it was. A subtle but unmistakable hollow note. Her heart began to beat a little faster. She remembered stories her father told of masons building secret compartments, priest holes, and strongboxes hidden in plain sight within their own work. It was a point of pride, a signature of their craft. She took the small, sharp pry bar from her father's tool roll. Carefully, she worked the tip into the seam. The fit was so tight she could barely gain purchase, but her father had taught her patience. She didn't force it. She worked the bar back and forth, applying steady, gentle pressure, listening to the tiny sounds of grit and stone. For a long time, nothing happened. Then, with a faint scraping sound, the stone shifted, just a fraction of an inch. Renewed, she repositioned the pry bar, finding a better angle. She put her weight into it, and with a deep groan of stone on stone, the slab lifted. It was heavy, far heavier than it looked, a solid block of granite a foot thick. She wrestled it up and over, revealing a dark, square cavity cut into the foundation. The air that rose from the hole was cool and dry, with no trace of rot or mildew. It smelled only of stone and time. Kneeling, she peered into the darkness. There, sitting perfectly centered in the void, was a heavy box made of dark wood and bound with straps of black iron. It was not large, perhaps the size of a small toolbox, but it looked immensely solid. Section She reached down, her hands closing around the cold iron. It was heavy, a dead, concentrated weight. She lifted it out and set it on the earthen floor. There was a simple, sturdy latch on the front, but no lock. Her breath caught in her throat. With trembling fingers, she lifted the latch. The lid opened with a soft, well-oiled whisper. The sight stole the air from her lungs. The box was filled to the brim with gold coins. They were not neatly stacked, but lay in a glittering, chaotic pile, glowing with a soft, buttery light in the dim cabin. They were old coins, heavy and unfamiliar. She reached in, her fingers sinking into the pile. The metallic chill of them, the sheer impossible weight of them was a shock. It was a fortune, a life-altering, staggering fortune. But beneath the gold, something else was tucked into the corner of the box. She carefully scooped away a handful of coins to reveal a book, its cover made of dark, supple leather, the pages held shut by a simple tie. She lifted it out. It was a journal. On the first page, in a strong, elegant script, were 2 words, Silas Kane. She sat on the floor of the ruined cabin, the iron box of gold beside her, and opened the journal. The ink was faded but clear. The first entry was dated 60 years prior. Silas wrote of his arrival in the mountains, his heart full of bitterness. He had been a builder in the city, a man with a reputation for quality and integrity, much like her own father. And like her father might have been had he lived, he was betrayed. His business partner, a man he had trusted like a brother, had swindled him, leveraging their shared company into ruin for his own secret gain, and leaving Silas with nothing but debt and disgrace. He had come to the mountains not to die, but to build one last thing for himself, a fortress of solitude against a world of liars. The journal was a meticulous record of his work. He detailed the selection of each stone, the felling of each tree. He wrote about the geometry of the roof trusses and the precise mixture of clay and sand for the chinking between the logs. It was a love letter to the craft, a testament to the salvation found in methodical, honest labor. Alara read, mesmerized, recognizing in his words the same philosophies her father had taught her. He wrote of the satisfaction of a perfect dovetailed joint, the quiet joy of seeing a wall rise plumb and true. She read for hours as the sun moved across the sky, her own hunger and exhaustion forgotten. She was not alone in her respect for this place. She was the second in a line of 2. Silas's voice, clear and strong from the page, was a companion in the silence. He wrote of the harsh winters and the glorious, fleeting summers. He documented the movements of deer and the cry of the hawk that nested on the cliff face. He had not been a hermit. He had been a steward. The last entry was different. The handwriting was slightly less steady, the date 20 years after the first. It was not a journal entry, but a letter. To the one who finds this, it began, "If you are reading this, then you have found my last and only legacy. And if you have found it, It is likely because you too understand stone and shadow, and you have a patient hand. You are no casual vandal. For that, you have my respect. The gold in this box is what I salvaged from the wreck of my life. It is more than I ever needed here. I leave it to you, without condition, save one. I ask that you do not let this place fall to ruin. These stones have been my only honest companions. This ridge has been my sanctuary. Live well within these walls. Add to them, if you have the skill. Find your own peace here, as I found mine. Alara had to stop reading. A profound, aching gratitude washed over her, so powerful it brought tears to her eyes. They were the first tears she had shed since her father's death. They were not tears of grief, but of kinship. This stranger, this ghost, had seen her, had known her, across a gulf of 50 years. He had left her not just a fortune, but a purpose and a blessing. She wiped her eyes and read on. There was a postscript. There is one more thing, a regret. In my anger and haste to leave the city, I wronged a good man, an apprentice named Elias Vance. He stood by me, and I repaid his loyalty with suspicion, accusing him of being part of the conspiracy against me. I was wrong. I learned the truth years later, but my pride kept me from making amends. If it is within your power, I ask that you find his family. They will not be wealthy. Give them a 10th part of this gold. Tell them it is the repayment of an old debt from an anonymous friend. It will not heal the wound I caused, but it may ease their path. He signed it simply, Silas Kane, Mason. Alara closed the journal, her hand resting on the worn leather cover. The sun was low in the sky again, but the light inside the small stone room felt different. It was no longer the light of an abandoned ruin, but the light of a home waiting to be reborn. The gold was a tool, nothing more. The real inheritance was the journal, the shared knowledge, the task. She was no longer an outcast. She was the next steward of Whisperwind Ridge. The work began the next day. It was no longer a grim task of survival, but an act of creation, of restoration. Inspired by Silas's notes and funded by his legacy, she worked with a singular, joyful focus. She drew up plans, not just to repair the cabin, but to complete it according to the vision Silas had laid out in his journal, a vision he never had the funds or the heart to finish himself. She took a small portion of the gold, hiking down to Terminus and then taking a bus to a larger town, 2 valleys over where she would not be recognized. There, she exchanged a few of the old coins for cash. She bought new tools, a broad-bladed felling axe, a sharp adze, a set of chisels, and a fine dovetail saw. She bought sacks of flour, beans, and salt, and arranged for them to be delivered to the general store in Terminus. The rest of the gold she reinterred beneath the hearthstone, a silent secret sleeping under her floor. Back on the ridge, the rhythm of her days was set by the sun and the demands of the work. She rose at dawn, the cold air sharp in her lungs. The first task was always to fell trees. She selected them with care, just as Silas had described, choosing straight, tall pines from the thicker groves to thin the forest and let in more light. The ringing of her axe was a sharp, percussive song in the immense silence of the mountain. The crash of a falling tree was a punctuation mark, the end of one life and the beginning of another. She learned the slow, arduous art of hewing logs, using the adze to strip the bark and flatten 2 sides, her body moving in a rhythm that was both exhausting and deeply satisfying. The scent of fresh-cut pine filled the air, a clean, medicinal perfume. She built a sawbuck and spent days sawing the logs to length, her muscles burning and hardening. Every notch she cut, every mortise she chiseled, was done with the precision her father had taught her. She was not just building a shelter, she was crafting a home. She was honoring 2 legacies at once. Weeks turned into a month, then 2. The collapsed timber section was cleared away, its few salvageable beams set aside. A new foundation of dry stacked stone was laid, extending from the original cabin. Slowly, painstakingly, the new walls began to rise, log by log. She learned the feel of the wood, the way it settled, the particular groan of a saddle notch seating perfectly. It was on a crisp afternoon in late summer, as she was wrestling a heavy log into place, that she had her first visitor. He was an old man, wiry and tough, with a wild shock of white hair and a face as weathered as the mountain granite. He moved up the trail with a quiet, steady gait, and stood for a long time just watching her, his arms crossed. He held a blacksmith's hammer in one hand. Alara, wary, stopped her work but did not speak. She simply met his gaze. He finally nodded, not at her, but at the wall she was building. "Good joinery," he said, his voice a gravelly rasp. "You're notching them deep. They won't shift." "I hope not," she replied, her own voice rusty from disuse. He walked closer, his eyes scanning her work with a critical, expert gaze. He pointed with his hammer at the corner. "You'll want to pin that last course. Wind gets fierce up here. Can lift a roof right off." He looked at her then, his eyes a pale, piercing blue. "I'm Jedediah. My forge is at the bottom of the trail. The sound of your axe carries. Thought I'd see who was making all the racket." "Alara," she said. He grunted. "Cane place. Figured it would fall down to the last stone." He looked at her small pile of tools. "That adze is chipped, and your father's hatchet needs a new temper. Bring them by my forge. I'll fix them." "I can't pay you," she said immediately. Jedediah scoffed, a dry, rustling sound. "Didn't ask for pay. You've got a pile of seasoned hardwood over there you've cleared. Good for charcoal. We'll trade. Work for work." He looked at the half-built cabin, then back at her. A flicker of something like respect showed in his eyes. "You're doing right by the place," he said, and without another word, he turned and walked back down the trail. It was the first crack in the wall of her solitude. A week later, she brought the tools down to his forge. Jedediah worked in a cloud of smoke and steam, the ring of his hammer on the anvil a constant, powerful heartbeat. He did not make small talk. He spoke of steel, of heat, of the way metal had a memory. He reforged her tools, giving them edges sharper than any she had ever known. In return, she promised him a cord of firewood, cut and stacked, before the first snow. A community, she realized, was not built on pleasantries. It was built on a foundation of mutual competence. Her next ally appeared in the form of Martha, the owner of the Terminus General Store. When Alara went down to collect her supplies, Martha, a stout woman with a no-nonsense demeanor, looked her over. "Jedediah says you're a worker," she stated, as if this were a formal certification. "Says you're building that old ruin back up proper." She hefted a sack of flour onto the counter. "He also says you're living on hardtack and hope. I'm putting a side of bacon and a dozen eggs on your account. You can work it off splitting wood for the store this winter." It was not a question. Alara found herself agreeing. Martha became her link to the valley, a source of supplies and taciturn encouragement. She never asked about Alara's past or where her money came from. She only seemed to care that Alara was self-sufficient and honest. The third was an old trapper named Abel, a man so quiet he seemed a part of the forest itself. He appeared one evening at the edge of her clearing, a brace of rabbits in his hand. He had seen the smoke from her chimney and knew it meant someone was on the ridge for the long haul. He showed her which springs never ran dry, where the chanterelle mushrooms grew thick after a rain, and how to read the coming weather in the flight of the birds. He spoke of Silas Kane with a kind of folk reverence, as a man who had understood the mountain. He saw the same understanding in Alara. With the help of her new, unspoken allies, the work accelerated. Jedediah forged custom hinges and latches for her doors and windows, intricate pieces of ironwork shaped like pine boughs and oak leaves. Martha ensured she had a steady supply of necessities, delivered by a pack mule once a month. Abel provided knowledge, the intangible wisdom of the landscape itself. By the time the aspens turned a brilliant, fiery gold, the cabin was transformed. The new structure was complete, its roof tightly shingled with hand-split cedar shakes. The walls were chinked with a mixture of clay and moss. Abel had shown her how to prepare. New windows, purchased on another trip to the valley, were set in place, their glass reflecting the vast mountain sky. The cabin was no longer two parts, but a single, harmonious whole, a testament to three craftspeople: Silas, who had dreamed it; her father, who had given her the skills; and herself, who had provided the labor. One afternoon, as she was fitting the final pane of glass, she saw a figure struggling up the trail. It was Al, the county clerk. He was red-faced and sweating, unused to the climb. He stopped at the edge of the clearing and stared, his mouth slightly agape. He was looking at the cabin, his expression a mixture of disbelief and something that looked suspiciously like envy. The ruin he had sold for a pittance was now a home, solid and beautiful, with a curl of smoke rising from its chimney into the crisp autumn air. It was a picture of everything he had declared impossible. He looked from the cabin to her, standing on the porch, her hands on her hips. He opened his mouth as if to speak, perhaps to mock, perhaps to ask a question. But no words came. There was nothing to say. His derision had been proven hollow. Without a word, he turned and began the long, clumsy descent back to his world of dusty papers and petty authority. Alara watched him go, feeling not triumph, but a quiet, solid sense of peace. As winter approached, a deep and early cold settled over the mountains. The first snows came, blanketing the ridge in a sea of white. Alara was ready. Her larder was full, her woodshed was stacked high, and the cabin was warm and tight. The fire in Silas Kane's hearth threw a cheerful dancing light across the room. Then the storm hit. It was not a normal winter storm, but a blizzard of historic fury. The wind howled like a hungry wolf, driving snow so thick it blotted out the world. The temperature plummeted. Down in the valley, the people of Terminus hunkered down, but Abel had warned her that the high passes would be a death trap. On the second night of the blizzard, a frantic banging on her door cut through the shriek of the wind. Alara grabbed a heavy iron poker from the hearth and unbarred the door. A figure, completely covered in snow, stumbled inside, followed by a blast of Arctic air. It was Abel. Behind him, huddled together, were a man, a woman, and two small children, their faces blue with cold. "Their wagon broke an axle on the pass," Abel explained, his words coming in ragged pants. "I saw their lantern. Knew you were the only shelter on this side of the mountain." Alara did not hesitate. She ushered them in, shutting the door against the raging storm. The family, travelers from the east, were half frozen and terrified. She sat them by the fire, wrapping the children in warm blankets. She ladled hot stew from the pot simmering over the fire, the rich smell of venison and root vegetables filling the cabin. The father, his hands shaking, tried to thank her, but she just shook her head. This was what a home was for. It was a sanctuary. For 3 days the storm raged. The little cabin on Whisperwind Ridge became an ark of warmth and safety. Alara's competence, her foresight, her hard work, it all coalesced in this act of service. The cabin her father's skills had taught her to build, on the land Silas Kane had bequeathed her, became a beacon. The family looked at her with a kind of awe. This quiet young woman who had single-handedly carved a fortress of safety out of the wilderness. She had saved their lives. When the storm finally broke and Abel led them down to the valley, the smoke rising from her chimney was no longer a mysterious rumor. It was a known signal of refuge and resilience. When spring finally returned, melting the snow and turning the mountainside green again, Alara knew it was time to fulfill the second part of her inheritance. She took a small bag of Silas's gold coins and, following a lead from Martha, found her way to a small, worn-down house in a neighboring town. There she found Elspeth Vance, the great-granddaughter of Silas's apprentice. She was an elderly woman, living alone in quiet poverty, her hands gnarled with arthritis. Alara did not give her name. She simply presented the bag of gold. "This is from an old family friend of your great-grandfather's," she said softly. "It is the repayment of a debt, long overdue." The old woman's eyes filled with tears as she looked at the impossible, shining gold. She spoke of the family story, of how her great-grandfather Elias had always spoken with sadness of a partnership that had ended in anger and misunderstanding, a loss that had shadowed his life. In that moment, Alara closed a circle that had been open for 60 years. She had not just delivered money, she had delivered peace. The final tableau was one of deep and quiet contentment. It was a warm evening in early summer, a year after she had first climbed the ridge. Alara sat on the porch of her finished home, a porch that hadn't existed a year ago, looking out over the valley. The cabin was no longer just a structure of wood and stone. It was an extension of herself. Every joint, every stone, every shingle held a memory of her labor and her purpose. The air smelled of pine and damp earth, and the only sound was the gentle whisper of the wind that gave the ridge its name. On the small, sturdy table beside her chair, two objects sat side by side. One was her father's brass plumb bob, its surface polished to a warm gleam, its point aimed eternally at the true center. It was the inheritance of skill, of truth, of a father's love. Beside it sat a small, intricately carved wooden bird, a tiny wren with its head cocked as if listening. She had found it tucked away in a small niche behind a loose stone in the chimney, exactly where Silas Kane's journal had said it would be. It was the only piece of his own decorative carving he had mentioned, his one small act of art for art's sake. It was the inheritance of place, of spirit, of a stranger's blessing. The two inheritances had merged. The skills her father had given her had unlocked the legacy of the man who came before, and his legacy had given her a place to root those skills and let them flourish. She had arrived on the ridge a ghost, an outcast with nothing but a few tools and a bitter memory. Now she was a steward, a savior, a quiet pillar of a community built not on proximity, but on respect. She had her home, her work, and her peace. The narration of her life was no longer about what had been taken from her, but about what she had built. The true inheritance had never been the gold. It was the competence in her hands and the resilience in her heart, the ability to look at a ruin and see a foundation. The $150 she had given to a mocking clerk in a dusty office had bought her the entire world. It was, without a single doubt, the best money she had ever spent.